but that one POC turned into like 70 pieces of POC very, very quickly. And they were across a huge amount of programming languages, a bunch of different platforms. And that is what really starts to drive the exploitation.
Both extremes are happening at the same time, and it's the extremes that we need to talk about, not averaging it out into a single statistic. Because, as someone once told me very memorably, if your head's in the oven and your legs in the freezer, on average, you're comfortable. Welcome to the Talos Threat Perspective. I'm Hazel Burton. Now, in the last episode, we looked at how attackers are using identity to gain and hold on to access. For this episode, we're looking at attackers' speed, specifically around vulnerability exploitation. Now, one of the clearest trends in the Talos 2025 year in review is the speed at which vulnerabilities are now being turned into working exploits. What used to take months or weeks is now taking days, sometimes hours. And it's not just faster, the whole thing has become industrialized. My colleague Joe, on a recent Beers with Talos podcast, likened it to how Henry Ford perfected the assembly line. So that industrialization changes the game for attackers, but how much does it affect defenders? We're going to talk about that. And we're going to start by talking about the number one most targeted vulnerability of the year, which was Reactor Shell, and that was released in December 2025.
It was available for less than a month, and it outpaced all vulnerabilities for the rest of the year. So, I mean, it's really like near instant weaponization.
What we saw most in that instance, I believe, is the impact of AI. So, what I mean by that is we saw a proof of concept code come out pretty quickly that is around that vulnerability that typically allows adversaries to start taking advantage of it. But that one POC turned into like 70 pieces of POC very, very quickly. And they were across a huge amount of programming languages, a bunch of different platforms. And that is what really starts to drive the exploitation.
So, what has changed here is that vulnerability exploitation is potentially much faster now, but also it's more repeatable. And Reactor Shell essentially became a turnkey solution for attackers. Now, I do want to add a very important caveat to that, which is that Reactor Shell and also Tool Shell, which was also really heavily exploited last year, they had some things in common as vulnerabilities. And that's not always going to be the case with every new vulnerability.
They could require a lot of particular expertise, things like heat management and a lot of other things, or heat manipulation that can really kind of raise the bar for exploitation. Whereas these other vulnerabilities sometimes kind of levels the playing field, allows a more wide swath of adversaries to take advantage.
However, attacker speed is only one part of the story. Attackers are still very much choosing to exploit what is exposed and what is going to get them something valuable. We analysed the top 100 most targeted vulnerabilities, and there are some clear trends in what attackers are going for.
Coming out of that data set, we see a trend of exploitation of unpatched devices and legacy infrastructure, specifically targeting systems that are no longer supported, like those end of life devices, or are deeply embedded in the software chain. There's one statistic that really pops out in that section. We saw nearly 40% of the top 100 targeted vulnerabilities impacted end of life devices.
So it's exposure, not just newness, that is key. And there are some vulnerabilities, regardless of age, that give attackers a lot more leverage than others.
These vulnerabilities impact shared software and frameworks. So I'm talking about flaws in like shared operating system platforms or vulnerabilities that are buried in libraries like Log4j. So instead of impacting, let's say, a single router, a specific version from a specific year. If you have a vulnerability that's impacting the operating system of that device, it could easily spread across an entire class of devices. So these really act as force multipliers. They have a much bigger blast radius.
So, on one hand, you have mass exploitation happening at the moment of a patch release or the publication of the details of the vulnerability, because once those details are out there, AI can very quickly turn proof of concepts into something very usable. On the other hand, we are still seeing vulnerabilities appear in the top 10 most targeted lists that have been around for over a decade. Both extremes are happening at the same time, and it's the extremes that we need to talk about, not averaging it out into a single statistic. Because, as someone once told me very memorably, if your head's in the oven and your leg's in the freezer, on average, you're comfortable. However, if this was a simple problem to solve, then we probably wouldn't be seeing decades old vulnerabilities appear in the top 10 list year after year after year. So something needs to change. So, next question, what needs to change? There are a couple of parts to this.
One, I think for patching, definitely moving to, if organizations haven't already, moving to a risk-based prioritization. We'd want to be prioritizing patches for vulnerabilities that impact identity decisions or shared software platforms like those operating systems, or vulnerabilities buried within libraries, those flaws that really act as force multipliers that we talked about.
We have to continue to work to make it easier to patch these systems. And so more autonomous capabilities on patching systems, not having to take things offline. And I think as an industry, we are working towards that. And in some cases, you might have a critical piece of equipment where you don't want autonomous updates going to that. You want to be able to push those updates. And so the ability to provide shields or patches that can help shield against a vulnerability, and then allowing the customer either to autonomously apply or to more manually apply those. We have to kind of provide those capabilities.
Let's talk about before shit hits the fan, right? Having that IR plan and playbook in place, doing tabletops with your security team so they know, like, when it comes time to say we need to hit the gas, we need to go, that everybody is ready. They know their positions, they know their role, they know they have their checklist, and they can react. And it's not a panic situation.
The industrialization of vulnerability exploitation is very much here, which means that it is now more important than ever to understand what is in your environment, what needs to be patched very urgently, what can't be patched, and how you would respond if something were to go wrong. That is all for this episode of the Talos Threat Perspective. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, do grab your copy of the Talos Year in Review. You can get it at blog.talosintelligence.com/2025 Year in Review. Alongside vulnerability trends, we've also got MFA bypass trends, we've got phishing trends, ransomware, and state-sponsored activity. So go check that out. We will be back with another episode of the Talos Threat Perspective very soon. But until then, thank you for watching and take care.